I thought I was just protecting my club from a couple of arrogant bullies, but within an hour, my life was being dismantled by a shadow organization using a fake investigation to steal everything I owned. I didn't know then that they had chosen the wrong target, or that the security footage they thought they'd suppressed was about to become the centerpiece of their own destruction. I stood in the corner of my own foyer, adjusting the silk pocket square of my suit, watching the evening rush begin. The Aurelius was the crown jewel of the city's nightlife, a sanctuary of velvet, crystal, and refined taste. I wasn't there as the owner tonight. I was there to observe. I liked the anonymity. It allowed me to see the raw, unfiltered truth of how people carried themselves when they thought no one of importance was watching. That was when I saw them. A couple draped in loud, aggressive branding, walking toward the VIP section with an air of entitlement that could strip the paint off the walls. They looked like they belonged on a reality television show, all bleached teeth and expensive, tacky gold, and they were making a scene before they even reached the maitre d's stand. The man, a beefy guy with a neck thicker than his head, was waving a stack of cash as if he were trying to fan himself. His companion, a blonde woman whose laughter sounded like glass breaking, kept tossing her head back, her eyes scanning the room with obvious disdain. They weren't looking for a cocktail. They were looking for an audience. As they reached the velvet rope, my lead host, Julian, stepped forward with his usual professional grace. He offered them a polite, practiced smile. "Good evening. Welcome to Aurelius. Do you have a reservation?" The man didn't look at Julian's face. He looked at his watch, then back at the velvet rope, sneering. "I'm not waiting in this cattle line," he barked, his voice carrying over the low hum of jazz. He reached out and shoved the rope aside. Julian didn't flinch, but his eyes hardened. I began to drift closer, my hands clasped behind my back, keeping my expression neutral. "Sir, I'm afraid I cannot allow you through without a confirmed booking," Julian said firmly. "The lounge is at capacity." The woman let out a harsh, mocking laugh, her gaze sweeping over the room until it landed on me. She didn't realize I was the one who signed the checks. She only saw a man in a dark suit standing in the shadows of the mezzanine. She pointed a manicured finger toward a table that had just been cleared, a table where a man was quietly sipping a single malt. She whispered something to her companion, and the man's face twisted into a sneer of pure, unfiltered venom. "Is that a joke?" the man bellowed, pointing at the patron who had just arrived. "You've got a certain type of clientele sitting in the best seats, but you're telling me, a man of my means, that you're full? I think I see what's going on here. You're letting the wrong kind of people in to boost your diversity numbers, aren't you?" The room went deathly silent. The music seemed to drop an octave. I felt the heat rising in my chest, a cold, calculated fury that I had spent years learning how to mask. I continued to walk toward them, my steps deliberate and silent on the marble floor. I heard the woman murmur something about standard slipping and unrefined riffraff, using words so vile they made my skin crawl. They were looking at the other patron, a brilliant architect I'd known for years, as if he were a piece of trash that had blown in off the street. "Listen, kid," the man said, getting right into Julian's personal space. "I've seen the types of places that try to act high class while they fill their chairs with people who don't belong. My money is better than his. You need to toss that guy out right now, or I'm going to make sure this place gets a visit from the health department, the fire marshal, and every inspector in the city. You don't want to know what happens when I decide a business is a blight on the neighborhood." He was threatening me. He was standing in my foyer, screaming racial slurs at a valued patron, and threatening to manufacture a headache for my business using his twisted sense of influence. I finally stepped into the light, my shadow falling long across the plush carpet. Julian caught my eye and stepped back, his posture relaxing instantly as he saw me approach. The man noticed the shift and turned to look at me, a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. "Oh, good," the man sneered, sizing me up and missing the fact that I was wearing a watch that cost more than his car. "Maybe you're someone who actually knows how to run a real business. Tell your employee here to get rid of that patron, or he's going to regret the day he decided to stand in my way." I stopped a few feet from him, letting the silence hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. I looked at the man, then at the woman, and finally at the patron they had been insulting. The patron gave me a subtle, knowing nod. I looked back at the loud-mouthed intruder, and for the first time that night, I let myself smile. Not a professional, welcoming smile, but a cold, sharp thing that made the man's grin falter. "You want to know how I run my business?" I asked, my voice smooth and dangerously low. "You've just given me the perfect demonstration." I signaled to the security team at the back of the room, and 4 men in sharp, charcoal gray suits materialized from the shadows, effectively cutting off the exit. The man's face lost its color, and his companion took a nervous step back, her eyes finally darting around the room to notice that every single head was turned in our direction. I wasn't just going to kick them out. I was going to make sure they remembered this night for the rest of their lives. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and clicked the camera icon, catching the look of pure, panicked realization on his face. "You see," I said, leaning in close enough for him to smell the expensive cologne he couldn't afford. "I don't just own the venue, I own the building, and I own the land it sits on. But more importantly, I own the recordings of every word you just said." I stepped aside, revealing a screen on the wall that had just flickered to life, showing a live feed of the foyer, including the audio from the last 5 minutes. "Now, before I have you thrown into the street like the trash you claim to be, would you like to see how fast the police arrive when I tell them you're trespassing? Or would you prefer I just send this to every news outlet in the state?" The silence that followed my words was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic pulse of the house music that seemed to mock the man's sudden fragility. The color had completely drained from his face, replaced by a sickly, pasty sheen. He looked at the camera lens I was pointing at him, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water. The woman, meanwhile, had stopped her posturing entirely. Her hand went to her throat, her eyes darting between the security guards who were closing in like wolves on a winter hunt. You can't do this," the man stammered, his voice losing its arrogant edge and dropping into a pathetic, whiny register. "Do you have any idea who I am? I have connections. I know people who can turn this place into a nightmare for you. You don't mess with someone like me." I didn't blink. I didn't even shift my weight. "I know exactly who you are," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "You're a man who thought his bank account gave him the right to degrade others in my home. And as for your connections, I suggest you call them. I'd love for them to see what you've been up to tonight. I imagine they'd be very interested to hear your little monologue about diversity and the wrong kind of clientele. I'm sure their public relations departments would love to get their hands on a high-definition recording of their associates' bigotry." The man's hands began to shake. He reached into his blazer, presumably for his phone, but the head of my security team, Marcus, stepped forward, his hand firmly resting on the man's forearm before he could complete the motion. "I wouldn't," Marcus said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Let's keep things civil. You're going to walk out the front door, you're going to get in your car, and you're going to drive away. If you ever, and I mean ever, try to step foot on this property again, you won't just be dealing with a ban. You'll be dealing with a legal firestorm that will strip you of everything you think makes you powerful." The woman tried to interject, her voice shrill and desperate. "This is outrageous! We were just joking around! You're taking this way out of context! Can't you take a joke?" I turned my gaze to her, and she withered under it. "A joke is something that makes people laugh, ma'am. What you did was attempt to demean a human being based on nothing but your own insecurities and hate. In this building, that's not a joke. That's a violation of everything I've built." I gestured to the door. "Get them out of my sight." As Marcus and his team escorted the pair toward the exit, the man stumbled, tripped over his own feet, and fell into the open door of a nearby booth. He looked up, his eyes burning with a mixture of shame and boiling, irrational rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You think you've won? You think you're so smart because you own a few square feet of expensive carpet? I know how this game works. People like you don't stay on top forever. I'm going to make sure you pay for this. I have friends in the city who can start a real investigation into how you built this little empire of yours. I'll see to it that you're looking at a serious investigation, something that will keep you tied up in courts for the next 20 years. You want to play the hero? I'll make sure you end up facing an inquiry that will dismantle everything you've worked for, piece by piece. He was sputtering, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He was no longer just angry, he was delusional. He was convinced that because he was wealthy, he could summon the machinery of the state to crush a business owner who didn't bow to him. He was threatening me with a targeted investigation, trying to frame my success as the result of a group or an organized scheme rather than hard work. "Keep talking," I said, stepping closer until I was inches from his face. "Every word you say is being recorded, every threat, every attempt to intimidate. You're only digging your grave deeper." "Watch me," he hissed, his eyes wide and unhinged. "You think you're untouchable? I'm going to make one call. By tomorrow morning, you'll have a visit from the Internal Oversight Board, and they won't be as polite as your security team. You'll be facing an inquiry that will look into every single penny, every single license, every single contract. I'll make sure they treat you like a criminal. I'll have them searching your walls for evidence of a forbidden network." He laughed, a jagged, broken sound, as he finally stood up, his suit rumpled and his dignity in tatters. "You've made a big mistake, kid. You have no idea the kind of storm you've just invited into your life." I watched them reach the door, the cold air from the street rushing in to meet them. They were finally out. I turned toward the patron, the architect, who had been watching the entire spectacle with a mixture of concern and admiration. I started to walk toward him, ready to offer a drink on the house and apologize for the interruption, when my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an unknown number. I frowned, pulling it out. I rarely gave this number out to anyone who wasn't in my inner circle. I swiped to answer, but before I could even say a word, a voice cut through the line. A voice that sounded too calm, too official, and entirely too familiar. It was the director of the city's licensing and oversight board. "Mr. Aurelius," the voice said, sounding like ice hitting a glass. "We've just received an anonymous tip claiming your establishment is serving as a front for a large-scale operation involving illegal goods and restricted activity. We have a team currently en route to conduct a comprehensive sweep of your premises. We'll be there in 10 minutes. I froze. The man at the door, the racist, arrogant fool I'd just kicked out, was already standing on the sidewalk, looking back through the glass. He had his phone to his ear, and he was staring directly at me, wearing a look of absolute, terrifying victory. He hadn't been bluffing. He had made the call. And the nightmare was just beginning. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, the sophisticated jazz now sounding like a funeral march. I stared at the man on the sidewalk. He wasn't just gloating anymore. He was savoring the destruction. He tapped his screen, gave me a mock salute, and stepped into his waiting town car, which peeled away from the curb with a screech of tires. He had orchestrated this perfectly. He knew exactly which strings to pull to weaponize the system against me. "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the bar. I didn't turn around. I couldn't afford to take my eyes off the entrance. "Clear the floor. Now. Discreetly. Tell the staff that we have an emergency inspection and we need to pivot to private dining only for the night. Do not mention anything about an investigation. Just get the guests out." Julian didn't ask questions. He was a professional to his core. He saw the blood drain from my face and knew the weight of the moment. He moved with a quiet, efficient urgency, signaling the servers to start closing out checks while I walked toward the back office. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not out of guilt, but out of the sheer, infuriating absurdity of it. I had spent years meticulously building this business, ensuring every permit, every tax filing, and every inventory log was beyond reproach. And yet, one bitter, hateful man with the right social connections could summon the state to tear it all down in an afternoon. I reached my office and locked the door behind me. I pulled up the security logs on my monitors, my fingers flying across the keyboard. If they were coming for a sweep, they would be looking for anything, a reason to shut me down, to seize the assets, to trigger a full-scale audit that would freeze my accounts for years. I needed to ensure that our internal compliance records were synced and ready. As I sat there, the screen flickered, and I saw a black SUV pull into the restricted loading zone at the rear of the building. Men in dark, nondescript suits stepped out, moving with a practiced, militaristic precision. This wasn't a standard city inspector's visit. These people were part of a specialized task force, the kind usually reserved for dismantling dangerous syndicates or investigating large-scale organized schemes. My chest tightened. Someone had fed them a massive lie, a narrative so compelling that it had bypassed the usual red tape and brought the hammer down on me within minutes of a petty argument. I stood up, adjusting my jacket, and caught my reflection in the window. I looked tired but focused. I walked out to the main floor just as the double doors of the foyer were thrown open. 3 men entered. The lead official, a man with steel-gray hair and eyes that looked like they hadn't seen a friendly face in a decade, bypassed the front desk and walked straight toward me, his hand resting on a folder tucked under his arm. "Mr. Aurelius?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "I am Agent Miller, Internal Oversight. We have received an urgent notification regarding the illicit use of this premises. Specifically, we have information suggesting that your facility is being utilized for the storage and distribution of forbidden cargo and restricted items. We are here to conduct a total inventory search." "Agent Miller," I said, meeting his gaze evenly. "You are welcome to inspect my books and my facility. I have nothing to hide. However, I should inform you that this is a retaliatory action. I have the entire incident recorded. A man just threatened to use your department to destroy my business because he was denied service for his racist behavior." Miller didn't even blink. He didn't seem interested in my story. He seemed focused on a script he had been given before he even arrived. "That is a matter for the police, sir. My concern is the security of this building. We are initiating a sweep of the entire basement, the storage lockers, and the private offices. If you attempt to obstruct us, you will be taken into custody immediately." He signaled his team, and they fanned out, moving toward the kitchen and the downstairs warehouse. I followed them, my blood boiling. I knew what they were looking for. A pretext. They were going to plant something, or they were going to misinterpret a legitimate shipment as something sinister. I watched as they ripped open boxes of high-end spirits, dumping bottles onto the floor, smashing glass, and tearing through the pantry. "Careful with that," I warned, watching a crate of rare bourbon be tossed aside. "That's inventory, not evidence. If we find what we're looking for, the inventory won't matter," one of the agents growled. Suddenly, from the basement, a shout rang out. The agent who had gone to the storage lockers came rushing back up, his face flushed with an expression of triumph. He was holding a small, nondescript black bag that I had never seen before in my life. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what they were going to claim was inside it. The agent held the bag up in the air, his eyes locking onto mine with a cold, predatory gleam. "We found it," he announced, his voice echoing through the silent, empty lounge. "Behind the ventilation panel in the secure storage room. This looks like a significant quantity of prohibited material. Mr. Aurelius, you are under arrest for the possession of forbidden substances and the operation of an organized criminal network." I felt the room tilt on its axis. The bag was a plant, a blatant amateurish frame-up. But it didn't matter. The weight of the accusation was immediate, and the presence of those specific items in my possession, even if forced, carried an automatic, massive penalty. I looked at Agent Miller, his expression now completely devoid of any doubt. He reached into his coat and pulled out a pair of steel cuffs. "You're finished," Miller whispered as he stepped toward me. "Your life as you know it ends right here." As he clicked the cuffs onto my wrists, I looked toward the security camera in the corner, praying the feed was still running, praying that the truth was saved somewhere the system couldn't reach. But as I was led out toward the patrol cars, I saw a familiar face watching from across the street. It was the man from earlier, standing in the shadows, holding his phone, a final, chilling grin on his face as he watched me being hauled away into a nightmare that seemed impossible to wake up from. The cold air of the evening hit my face, but it was nothing compared to the ice settling in my veins as they shoved me into the back of a nondescript sedan. The metal of the handcuffs bit into my wrists, a physical reminder that my autonomy had been stripped away in the span of an hour. Through the tinted window, I watched my life's work. The beautiful, shimmering facade of the Aurelius, dim its lights one by one. The staff stood on the sidewalk, looking on in shock as the team from the Internal Oversight Board sealed the doors with bright, official-looking tape. "You're making a mistake," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the cramped confines of the vehicle. I was speaking to the back of Agent Miller's head. "That bag was planted. You, of all people, should know that professional operations don't keep contraband in a vent right next to the main supply closet." Miller didn't even look back. He was scrolling through a tablet, his thumb moving with a rhythmic, detached speed. "We have the evidence, Mr. Aurelius. The lab will confirm the contents of those packets within the hour, and then the legal machinery takes over. You aren't just looking at a business closure, you're looking at a serious charge, the kind that carries an enormous term behind bars. You should have thought about the company you kept." "I don't know who put it there," I snapped. "That's exactly what they all say," he replied coolly. The ride to the holding facility was a blur of neon lights and shadow. My mind was racing, trying to deconstruct the last hour. The man at the club, the one who had initiated this, had connections deep enough to bypass standard protocol. This wasn't just a petty grudge. This was a surgical strike. He wanted me erased. He wanted my business liquidated, my reputation incinerated, and me buried under a mountain of legal paperwork that would make it impossible to ever recover. When we arrived, the facility was a concrete monolith, dark and imposing. They didn't process me through the standard intake area. Instead, they took me to a quiet, windowless room in the basement. It was a space designed for interrogation, sterile and smelling of industrial cleaner. I was chained to the table, my jacket taken, my phone long since confiscated. An hour passed. Then 2. The silence was psychological warfare. Every minute that ticked by was a minute the evidence had to be processed, logged, and solidified into an unshakable narrative. Finally, the door creaked open. It wasn't Miller who walked in, but a man in a sharp gray suit who looked more like a corporate lawyer than a government official. He carried a single manila folder. "Mr. Aurelius," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting opposite me. He didn't introduce himself. "You've had a very difficult evening. It's a shame, really. A beautiful venue. It would be a pity to see it turned into a parking lot." "Who are you?" I demanded. "I'm the person who can make this go away," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Or, I'm the person who can ensure the prosecutor receives every piece of evidence we've collected. You see, the packets we found? They've been sent to the lab. We have the authority to expedite the results. We could find they contain nothing of concern, or we could find they contain exactly the prohibited substances needed to keep you away for 20 years. It's all about the interpretation of the facts." My heart hammered. He was offering a deal, but not the kind I wanted. "What do you want?" "The deed," he said simply. "Transfer the property and the ownership of the Aurelius to the holding company I represent. Sign the papers, and we'll report that the search was a misunderstanding, a clerical error involving a previous tenant. You'll be free to walk out that door within 10 minutes, and you'll never hear from us again." He slid a document across the table. It was a legal transfer of all my assets. It was everything. It was the fruit of my labor, the inheritance I'd saved for, the reputation I'd built from the dirt up. He wanted me to hand it over to the very people who had orchestrated my downfall. "You're a thief," I spat. He just smiled, a thin, paper-cut smile. "I'm a businessman, just like you. And you're currently in a position where your business is about to be seized by the state anyway. Wouldn't you rather walk away with your life than spend the next few decades reflecting on your hubris?" I looked at the pen he'd placed beside the document. I looked at the security camera in the corner of the room, blinking with a small red light. I realized then that they weren't just trying to steal my business, they were trying to break my spirit so that I wouldn't fight back once I was released. They needed me to admit guilt, to sign away my rights, to validate their frame-up. "I'm not signing," I said. The man's expression darkened. He stood up, smoothing his suit. "I was afraid you'd say that. I really was. Because that means I have to hand the file over to the prosecutor downstairs. And you know, once it's in their hands, the process becomes entirely public. It becomes a matter of record. He turned toward the door but stopped. Before I leave, you should know one thing. That client you defended earlier, the architect, he was a nice touch, but he couldn't save you. In fact, he's currently in custody as well. We found his fingerprints on the packages in that bag. You're not just going down for possession. You're going down for being the mastermind of an entire illicit syndicate. My blood ran cold. They had framed him too. They were linking us together to make the organized scheme narrative look bulletproof. I lunged forward, but the chains pulled me back, slamming me against the hard plastic of the chair. "Enjoy the cell, Mr. Aurelius," he said, opening the door. "Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention, the man you kicked out? He's in the waiting room right now. He's going to be the lead witness for the state against you." As he stepped out, I heard the heavy, metallic thud of the door locking behind him. But then, a soft click came from the table. My phone, which I thought had been confiscated, sat inside a transparent evidence bag on the side table. Suddenly, its screen lit up. A video was playing. It was a clear, high-definition recording of the entire encounter in my office, the moment the agents had broken in and planted the bag. The phone wasn't just recording, it was broadcasting. And the person watching on the other end was the one person they never expected me to have in my corner. My eyes widened as I saw the name on the caller ID. It was the lead investigator for the city's Internal Ethics Commission, the one person in the entire government who had been trying to take these very same men down for years. The red light on my phone didn't just blink. It pulsed with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. The broadcast was live, streaming the footage of the frame-up directly to the one office in the city that could actually start a fire under this corrupt network. I saw the screen refresh as a text message popped up. "We see it all. Stay calm. The cavalry is already at your door." The man who had tried to extort my business, the lawyer, hadn't noticed the phone because he was too busy basking in his own manufactured victory. He thought he had me broken. He thought he had the entire board tilted in his favor. He had no idea that my own security system had been rigged to sync with a secondary, encrypted server the moment those doors were breached. I wasn't just a business owner. I was a man who understood the value of high-grade surveillance. Suddenly, the heavy steel door of the interrogation room didn't just creak. It swung open with a violent thud. It wasn't the lawyer, and it wasn't the corrupt agents. It was the director of the city's Internal Ethics Commission, flanked by 4 officers in uniform. Real police officers, the kind who hadn't been bought and paid for by the lobby of vultures currently trying to tear my life apart. "Mr. Aurelius," the director said, his voice clipped and efficient. He gestured to the officers, who immediately moved to uncuff me. "I believe you have some evidence that might be of interest to us." The lawyer, who had been lingering in the hallway, turned pale as he saw the commission's team. His smug, paper-cut smile dissolved into a look of pure, primal terror. He reached for his briefcase, but an officer was already there, pressing him against the wall. "You're all under investigation," the director said, his eyes scanning the room. "Including the agents currently in your building. We've been tracking this organized scheme for months, waiting for them to make a move big enough to catch them in the act. You just handed us the evidence we needed on a silver platter." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. I watched from the sidelines as the men who had threatened me, insulted my patrons, and attempted to steal my legacy were dismantled by their own hubris. The lawyer was dragged out in cuffs, shouting about his connections that suddenly didn't mean anything. The agents, who turned out to be private thugs on a payroll, were processed for the unauthorized use of state credentials and the planting of evidence. I walked out of that dark, sterile room into the cool night air of the precinct parking lot. My architect friend was there, being released from a separate processing area, looking shaken but relieved. We shared a look, a nod of mutual respect that transcended the chaos. The man who had started it all, the one with the expensive suit and the hateful heart, was sitting in the back of a police cruiser, his head buried in his hands. He looked small. He looked like exactly what he was, a bully who had finally run into something he couldn't buy or break. As I walked past the cruiser toward my own vehicle, he looked up, his eyes meeting mine. There was no more hate left in them, only a desperate, hollow realization that he had gambled his entire life on a single act of petty spite and had lost everything. I didn't say a word to him. I didn't have to. Returning to the Aurelius felt like walking into a sanctuary. The police had cleared the scene, the official tape was stripped away, and the staff was waiting for me. There was no fanfare, just a quiet, profound sense of endurance. I walked behind the bar, picked up a glass, and poured a drink for the architect and for Julian. "To the house," I said, raising my glass. "To the house," they echoed. The following weeks were a storm of legal proceedings, but the tape from my office made it impossible for them to twist the narrative. The story of the attempted extortion, the racism, and the attempted frame-up made headlines across the country. The Aurelius didn't just survive, it became a symbol. People started lining up around the block, not just for the atmosphere, but to support the principle. As for the racist couple and their conspirators, they were hit with a tidal wave of fallout. The company they represented cut all ties within 48 hours, and the investigation into their organized scheme spiraled into a massive probe that exposed years of corporate malpractice. They didn't just lose their influence, they faced heavy consequences under the law for their attempt to use the system as a weapon. They became the cautionary tale they had once laughed at. I stood on the mezzanine on a Friday night, months later, watching the room hum with life. I saw a diverse, vibrant crowd of people laughing, dancing, and enjoying themselves. My patron, the architect, was sitting at his favorite table, and he looked up and caught my eye, raising his glass. I smiled back, feeling the weight of the past months finally lift. I had learned that some people think their money buys them a world where they are the only ones who matter. They think they can force their way into any room and spit on anyone they choose. But they forgot one thing. A room is only as strong as the person who builds it, and a legacy is only as strong as the integrity of the person standing behind it. I was still there, the venue was still standing, and for every hateful person trying to tear down the world, there were 10,000 more who just wanted to build something beautiful. I poured another drink, turned to the bustling room, and finally let myself enjoy the view. The Aurelius was mine, and it wasn't going anywhere.